be highly dependent upon foot strike pattern, but roughly it's going to be about 36 degrees. The values assume a rear foot or mid foot strike pattern, as I alluded to. Other sources would suggest that you would need 25 degrees and up to 10 degrees of plantar flexion, comparable to the excursion of 35 degrees. So that's other sources beyond the Ordendorff article that has been cited here. In the frontal plane, inversion and eversion, other sources, Ferber 2014 and Hawley in 2008, suggest that there's a joint excursion of about 20 to 24 degrees. So you need 10 to 12 degrees of inversion and eversion, and obviously the ability to control it is going to be important, but we'll discuss that in future slides. This is really just more around the joint range of motion. You can see in the image that's populated there with the graph, on the x-axis is going to be the percent of the stance phase of gait, and then on the y-axis is going to be the subtalar joint, specifically eversion and inversion respectively. And you can see during the initial contact to loading response that the foot's going to most rapidly go from an inversion state where you hit on the posterior lateral aspect of the heel, and then go rapidly roll through to the more of a flat foot and flat heel position, which will go into an inverted and determined by the patient's and person's capacity at the foot and the ankle to control that will determine like the amount of excursion that they will go through and how much in eversion will occur. You can see that this varies dramatically, anywhere between approximately with a range of 5 degrees of eversion up to 25 degrees, with a mean being around 12. And then when you're looking at external and internal rotation around the tibia, this is also important to consider. Once again, you're going to, as the individual goes into a more pronated or everted position, that's going to correspond to more of a tibial internal rotation. And that will get them into approximately 5 degrees. But again, there's quite a range there, anywhere between approximately 2 and up to 12 degrees. When you look at the ankle running demands and the kinematics, so looking at a similar graph to what we had shown on the previous slide. So let's talk about ankle pronation and eversion of the hind foot during running. So you have the duration of eversion, which is the longer duration of eversion is associated with injuries such as Achilles tendinopathy, the medial tibial stress syndrome. This suggests that the time that the foot spends in an everted position during the stance phase is a critical factor in injury risk prevention and reduction, rather than the amount or speed of eversion. So the amount is like how much they actually evert, and then the rate, how quickly they go into that. The amount of eversion, while the amount of rear foot eversion is a recognized risk factor, especially in conditions like iliotibial band syndrome, it is not consistently linked to all types of running injuries. And then same with the rate of eversion, though it can put a lot of stress on individuals that have a posterior tibialis tendinopathy, and thus it may be relevant. It doesn't fall out as a predominant risk factor, at least based off these 5 sources and the scoping review of the literature that I've done thus far. So far and away, the powerhouse for forward propulsion during running is going to be the ankle plantar flexors, and our gold standard for testing methodology is going to be our isokinetic dynamometer. So there's multiple positions that have been described in regards to how to set someone up on an isokinetic dynamometer to test their plantar flexion strength. I've explored several of them This is the one that I have found consistently gives the best results. By best results, I'm talking about the coefficient of variance and the reliability and the consistency of testing, as well as the patient stability and patient comfort. When the patient is more comfortable and feels more stable, then they're able to produce more force. I will also acknowledge that it is the position where I found that the influence of the more major muscle groups are also eliminated based off the straps that you can see there and the positioning of the limb. So the patient is in supine, knee extended, and hip at 0, pelvis, waist belt, as well as the tibial thigh belt. Stabilization is manually done by holding on to the frame. And then the normality of the force curve is what you're looking for first and foremost. I call it the strength curve profile. Peak and average torque, so limb symmetry index, and then torque to body weight. Total work produced, fatigue index is also considered, and then looking at ratio. So there's really 6 predominant metrics that would be considered when you're looking at the isokinetic dynamometry for your foot and your ankle, and in this case, particularly the plantar flexion. All right, so without losing the theme of our kinematics and kinetic demands for the foot and the ankle are going to be shown here. And so for your plantar flexion and your dorsiflexors, in regards to normalized force production, you would want to produce at least 2/3 of body weight out of the plantar flexion concentrically, and then that's going to be at 5.8 miles per hour, and then at the upper rung here, at least speed-wise, but you can see that there's a linear increase in the amount of force that is needed relative to body weight out of the plantar flexors as you get faster and faster, and here it would be a minimum of 80% of body weight produced concentrically. So I gave the 6 different criteria previously when we were looking at the positioning of the isokinetic. Here I give a little bit more specificity in regards to the criteria necessary. So we have the greater than 90% limb symmetry index. The mean normative data is shown there, and you'll notice that it's dependent upon the type of muscle contraction, the gender, as well as the speed of contraction. And so there's ranges that are given. Those ranges are 1 standard deviation around the mean. So the mean would be if you just took the difference between the two values. So if we just took that first value in the upper left-hand corner for males of plantar flexion concentrically, 49 to 65% body weight, then you would be looking at approximately 57% of body weight concentrically would be normative value there. And then we saw previously in the last slide that you would want the individual to be able to produce up to 80% of body weight, and those values can really only be achieved during the eccentric aspect of the testing range, and during those higher forces, which would be produced at 30 degrees per second. And when we saw on the last slide where the point at which the plantar flexion strength or moment was the highest was during that loading response. So that would be during the eccentric, where the plantar flexors would be working eccentrically and then pushing forward into the concentric direction for forward and horizontal propulsion. Speaking briefly about the curve analysis, so I alluded to earlier that the plantar flexion muscles are dorsiflexion biased. What do I mean by that? So I'm in the figure below, I'm trying to convey that. So on the y-axis, you have torque in foot-pounds, and then across the x-axis, you have the ankle joint angles, with negative values of joint angle corresponding to dorsiflexion, whereas the positive correspond to that of plantar flex position. And you can see that the normal strength curvature and profile of the plantar flexors are going to be kind of like a childhood playground slide that you may see in your neighborhood, where you have a very strong spike in force initially due to the pre-resting tension of the plantar flexors, which assist in the muscle to produce force. And then there's going to be a gradual decrease in the force production as the individual achieves more and more plantar flexion. The blue line here represents a healthy limb. The pink line represents an unhealthy limb, specifically an individual who was tested that had an Achilles tendon rupture. So you can see that their magnitude of force is less. You can also see that their strength curve is shifted to the left, such that it's more difficult for them to produce force in the more plantar flex position. And this yellow bar represents the neutral angle. With the greatest force, as I alluded to, being in the max dorsiflex position, and then with the Achilles tendon rupture, typically because of the slight lengthening that can occur afterwards, that there can be a shift in the force curve, which makes it difficult for them to elevate their heel off the ground. Achilles tendinopathy, this would be an abnormal force curvature, and you can see that there's a dip that occurs right around the mid-range, and this can be associated due to cortical inhibition and or pain response, or a combination of the two, but it does not represent what we saw historically in the previous example of the strength curve of the individual that I was alluding to. At least even in the limb that was Achilles tendon repaired, had a relatively normal curvature despite the shift that we spoke about to the left. But in your Achilles tendinopathy, where you have kind of an M-shaped curvature, that would be less than ideal, and something that would be needing to be addressed, and identifying the root causes would be important in order to be able to normalize this, rather than just verbally coaching someone through the test. So similar to the figure that you saw on the previous slide, with the exception that things are slightly reversed and reflected. So here you can see that the force curve is below the zero, representing a negative torque because it's eccentric force production. And then though the numbers still represent the same conventional plantar flexion with positive numbers and negative numbers representing dorsiflexion respectively, they are on different ends of the spectrum. And here, once again, you can see the inverted curve shape and strength curve profile that you saw concentrically. It would be, so it should be a reflection, an inversion of what we saw concentrically. You can see that there's a little bit of lack of coordination here. It's not nearly as smooth and doesn't represent your same childhood slide nearly as well as it did concentrically. And this would be other examples of your abnormality in your eccentric strength curvature. So it can either be a single blip or multiple blips, where people have difficulty with the coordinated ongoing force going through an eccentric rapid contraction. But given the fact that the plantar flexors are going to be important, depending on, again, the foot strike pattern, they're going to work eccentrically, but then they're also going to be necessary to be working concentrically for the forward propulsion. I'll quickly talk about the dorsiflexion strength. Usually they contract in a co-contractive fashion for joint stability, but are less important given, not strange from the hamstrings at the knee that we discussed, that there's still going to be a predictable kind of pre-stretched greater force capacity in the plantar flex position, and then as you move to a neutral position, it's going to the force production is going to rapidly decline. So just like the plantar flexors are dorsiflexion biased, so are the dorsiflexors going to be plantar flexion biased in their force production. And so this is looking at a concentric and then an eccentric dorsiflexion strength, respectively. Obviously noting that in the eccentric figure here, unlike what was shown in the previous graph, just out of convention in the way that the graph was set up, is that it's not an inverted, or the force here is not representing the negative, but it's still a normal strength curvature that mimics that of the concentric. So when we look at the ankle joint power and the rate of torque development of the plantar flexors, that they are working much more intensely in their concentric action than they are in their eccentric. Specifically, almost like twofold, just over a twofold increase concentrically than they are eccentrically, even though they do have that eccentric role. The testing protocol would be isometric, seated or supine, as shown historically. Ankle slightly dorsiflex into 15 degrees. You can see the cutoffs there of what we would want. Running ideal cutoff would be greater than 3.0 foot-pounds per second per pound of body weight, as shown above, and this would be in the concentric fashion. And then our rate of torque development, again, I would encourage us to be using the RTD 2080 for the rationale previously described at the knee, because research, at least to date, does not help us out as to determining what it would be at the ankle. When we're trying to determine the rationale for the ankle angle, when we look at the greatest, the moment within the gait cycle that there is the greatest concentric generation of force for the plantar flexion, the plantar flexors, what we can see is that correlates, at least time point wise, to about 15 degrees of dorsiflexion. Which would be kind of mid-range dorsiflexion, and that would be the rationale also to be able to produce the greatest amount of force for the plantar flexors, as I mentioned, that they are dorsiflexion biased. Okay, so that was a lot of talk around the isokinetic dynamometer and how to go through the process of really doing your testing protocol and having your criteria that would establish the safety of returning to jogging for the foot and the ankle complex. That being said, I certainly recognize the fact that the isokinetic dynamometer, having access to such, is a luxury, and that I would say the vast majority of people and clinicians don't have that available to them. So what are the other ways that we can be testing out our plantar flexion strength? Probably the most common performed assessment for looking at the muscle performance of the foot and the ankle is a single leg calf raise. Just because it's common in clinical practice, I don't think that it's common practice to perform it in a structured or standardized fashion. I think that there's value in doing so because it enhances our reliability as well as the validity and the repeatability of the assessment. So if I could give some insights and detail as to how this may be executed, so you can see the patient position, single leg stance, locked out at 0 degrees at the knee as well as at the hip. The ankle can either be off the ground as shown, or it can be on a 10 degree slant board into dorsiflexion. The forearm length away from the wall is the distance that is standardized. So the individual adducts their arms, puts their fist out, and then puts their fist flush against the wall, and that would be their standardized distance from one time point to the next. The equipment that you're going to need is a tape measure for the heel height. A calf raise app is optional, which could give you the power of the heel height, the loss of heel height, as well as the number of repetitions. And then the metronome app for standardizing the tempo at which they perform it, and then a wall or stable object for them to support themselves on. You can see the starting position again at 0 degrees in this instance, but it can be in that dorsiflex position, which we spoke about previously, that the plantar flexors are dorsiflexion biased, thus it may be actually advantageous to do it through a negative range of motion. I provided the heel height statistics there for you in regards to the reliability, the standard error of measure, and what you can deem to be the minimal detectable change as a percent of the heel height. It's important to recognize that the performance of this assessment does not correlate nearly at all with someone's plantar flexion peak torque. And so it is really a different construct that is being assessed here. It is really muscular endurance and work capacity of the foot and the ankle and the calf muscles. And not to neglect its value. Again, I think it's important, especially with the amount of volume that people do with their foot and the ankle, be it running, jogging, athletic endeavors, non-athletic endeavors, just life in general, that it's important to have high work capacity, but just recognize what we're actually measuring when we actually take the number of repetitions or number of repetitions to fatigue. The tempo, as I mentioned, is going to be standardized at 60 beats per minute. That's a tick at the top and a tick at the bottom. I will have a consistent distance away from the wall, and then you can see that I use a ruler there to monitor their heel height. Usually the assessment drops when their heel height, they can no longer achieve the same heel height of 80% of which they started. This would be considered to be a sufficient field test. Again, it's measuring muscular endurance rather than muscular strength. And I circle the knee only for the instance that common compensation is that they're going to flex at the knee, and they also will lean into the wall rather than going vertically straight up, which is also a means by which they can gain mechanical advantage to improve the performance with the heel height elevation. Okay, so as I alluded to with the single leg raise test, you can utilize the calf raise app. It will monitor peak height, that is heel height, total heel height over the duration of the set, the percent of heel height loss over said number of repetitions, which will give you a fatigue index that you can monitor between limbs as well as across time. It will give you total work as well as total power that is produced during the set. The concurrent validity here is good to excellent for total work. Number of repetitions, 100% consistent with a linear encoder. It is important to note that using a heel as the surrogate center of mass for the body overestimates the total work by 21 to 25% compared to the gold standard of a 3D motion capture system, but it is and able to precisely detect the relative difference between the limbs, and thus it's a reliable measure even if it underestimates the total power. And we also know that using the heel rise work test is valid when using it relative to the difference in the other limb. And it would also be, it's important to note that the total work is a more granular and more a valid metric to determine disability after Achilles rupture and or repair than is heel height or number of repetitions alone. All right, sticking with our quality assessment of the single leg calf raise test, I will say that there's been published research that would suggest that and shows that if quality assurance is not implemented with this assessment, that the number of repetitions and the overall outcome measures are significantly different. So you want to maintain the original footprint throughout the entirety of the assessment, especially if you're doing it on a slant board. Sometimes people will tend to drift backwards. For your foot and ankle mechanics, you want to have plantar flexion of both the ankle and plantar flexion of the foot itself. I'll give an example moving forward. And then the test stops when the metronome pace cannot be maintained. Heel height drops by 20%. Knee flexion occurs with proper cueing and they're unable to correct or unwilling. And then hip propulsion strategy was used where they essentially use momentum based, lean forward, and or ensure, and you need to ensure that the majority of the force goes through the first and the second metatarsal head, rather than what you can see there is more of a sickling effect of the foot as it's known, where you go into an inversion moment. Even though that is a natural means, when you get to your end range plantar flexion, you want to try and ensure that that you're testing what you think you're testing, which typically it's going to be the gastroc and soleus complex with a bias to the gastroc given the straight knee. yet you're not really looking for the compensation of the posterior or the tibialis posterior or peroneal muscles. And then the ankle maintains alignment with the second toe pointed due north or perpendicular to the wall. So again, as I mentioned, though the inversion of the rear foot is normal during single leg heel raise, excessive inversion would be an unbalance between the peroneal muscles and the tibialis posterior, and give me more of a compensation for weaker plantar flexors, and thus should be controlled. And again, without controlling these parameters and having a standard operating procedure, the outcome and thus the validity and the reliability of your assessment becomes more in question. So in the previous slide, I mentioned one of the criteria is having plantar flexion at the foot as well as at the ankle. And so I just want to give some examples of what that looks like, which would be in this upper left-hand corner. And if you see this, have them continue to train on. If you see this, it's an ankle problem. They're getting more plantar flexion at the midfoot rather than at the ankle joint. And you can see the small schematic there denoting the difference. And you can kind of compare and contrast that, particularly with the angle that is achieved by the lower shank as well as the calcaneus. The other issue is a foot problem, right, where someone plantar flexes at the ankle but then collapses through the mid-arch and they go into more of a dorsiflexion at their midfoot. And then this is a problem on both accounts, where you have limited heel height and limited plantar flexion at the midfoot. And you can kind of see I've kind of plugged in the small lines there as an indication of red and green as those angles that are being adequate and those angles that are being inadequate as demonstrated in red. And so when you're looking at the plantar flexion calf raise assessment, yes, get your quantitative metrics of work, heel height, total number of repetitions, even the power if you're using the application I suggested. But then you're also performing these quality assessments that are giving you even more information beyond just the numbers themselves. All right, and then, yeah, you can't go wrong with the old-fashioned field-based testing, 1RM testing, and you can do it both with knee extended as well as knees flexed. What I have found is that for the knee flex position, that the seated calf raise machine is the gold standard. It's really hard to otherwise replicate it. Otherwise, though, people certainly have found creative means by doing so. I find that I consistently kind of underload people, and they can do an excessive number of repetitions. I can't load them adequately enough, especially when we know that the soleus can, isometrically can produce 2 times body weight or more, depending on the caliber of your athlete and their strength. And then for the leg press assessment, you can see there that I have it's a little bit hard to see, but that red line indicates that I'm holding a stick to ensure that they are able to achieve the same heel height on each subsequent repetition and having them lock it out. I do it 60 beats per minute, similar to what I had mentioned previously with the standing version. And then I also will start people at 50% of their body weight, seeing how many repetitions they can do, especially for our goals are not pure strength, but we're still on the endurance endeavor. Obviously, you can increase the percentage of what they're lifting relative to their body weight if your goals are to actually measure strength, and depending on what your target 1 rep max is. Same stopping criteria as I mentioned with the single leg calf raise. Okay, so then what do you do with the results? So I found really good application and utility with this app, right? So you have the one RM, I believe it's called, and I will just put in the number of repetitions that they achieved as well as the weight lifted, and it will quantify their predict their 1 rep max, and then it also can be utilized for prescriptive means as far as if I'm going to send them home with X amount of repetitions, sets, etc., sticking by our strength and conditioning principles and trying to ensure that they're lifting a certain percentage of their 1RM. And certainly you can also utilize the calf raise app with both of those previous assessments that will give you the heel height, the power, and the work, both positive and negative, as well as the vertical height loss as shown there. So if you are going to be using the field-based test of the seated calf raise machine for your assessment, then the methodology that would be recommended would be you'd be sitting with the hips 90 degrees flexed, knees at 100 degrees, ankles about 10 degrees of dorsiflexed. The equipment would be your seated calf raise machine or Smith machine, a ruler or tape measure for heel height, and or the calf raise app as previously shown would be the recommended. The testing protocol would be a warm-up of 1 to 2 sets of 5 submaximal reps. Initial resistance, the load would be a comfortable lifting, a comfortable amount to be lifted, incrementally increasing by about 5 to 10 pounds. Subject performs 1 repetition for each weight increase. Rest periods of 3 to 5 minutes as per the best practice of strength and conditioning principles as described by the NSCA. And then the final attempt will 1 RM max weight lifted for full range of motion. You get a failed attempt of 4 to 6 attempts. And then the pro tips for reliability and validity, full heel height achieved on the final repetition or recorded weight, and ensure neutral foot position equally pressing through the first and the second toe. The reliability has shown to be pretty good here. The MDC or SEM, that is minimal detectable change, and standard error measure has yet to be determined. The coefficient of variance from one testing point to the next should be within 5 to 6%. So for some normative values of what you can expect for beginner to up to elite or advanced would be shown there for both the males and females. Once someone hits kind of that intermediate phase, they should be producing approximately 1 times body weight or 1.25 for males. A great assessment that has been popular by Vol Performance, where you have the patient in a similar position to that of the single leg calf raise. The equipment that you're going to be needing is going to be a barbell or isometric rack. Obviously, a force plate is going to be necessary or a comparable system. I have a standardized warm-up comparable to what I utilize for individuals with ACL. So we go 3 minutes, stationary bike, 1 watt per kilogram. So if someone's 75 kilos, then they're going to be trying to put on 75 watts on the bicycle. This takes into equation, obviously, both the RPM, the revolutions per second, as well as the resistance on the bike. So obviously some of these resistance, the bikes, their resistance is arbitrary units. It's like 1, 2, 3, so on and so forth. But the watts are quantifiable and universal across different bikes, and so that's why I utilize that. You're going to want to have specific warm-ups of 3 by 3 second efforts, gradually increasing in their intensity. The tempo obviously is going to be isometric. They're going to be doing 3 to 5 max efforts per leg with 60 seconds rest in between the sets. They're going to be doing 3 to 5 repetitions of 5-second holds, 2 seconds build up, 3 seconds max effort. If you're looking for more for rapid force testing and your rate of force development, that you're going to be doing 5 by 1 second. It's going to be 10 seconds recovery, and you repeat it 2 to 3 times. The coefficient of variance with this is acceptable with less than 3 to 10% difference in the overall output from one repetition to the next and across time. The minimal detectable change in standard error of measure, however, is still yet to be determined. And as I alluded to, this is going to be a good test. It's going to have both muscle strength capacity as well as muscle power. Okay, so for the soleus biased setup, so there's been multiple setups that have been described. In the first column, you can see the force plate with the half kneeling position. Relatively a nice setup, particularly because it takes away the compensation that can occur with hip flexion going up into the dynamometer or whatever the force gauge is that you're utilizing, which can be an issue with the middle two where you're using the more marketable setups of the force frame as well as the physiometer. Both have shown to be reliable and valid. Of note, with the half kneeling position, sometimes people can be somewhat unstable, though the image demonstrates and what the authors have described is going arms across chest, having the individual hold lightly onto something stable can allow them to be more stable proximally and produce more accurate force output. If you're going to go with your do-it-yourself option with the handheld seated dynamometer, as shown there with the belt as well as the microfit handheld dynamometer, a couple of key things that you're going to want to keep in mind is that the belt really needs to be in a vertical plumb line over the metatarsal heads, and the belt tension is also going to be you're going to want to cinch that up. I'll give you further specifications as we go through this in order to ensure that the heel does not rise. So your testing recommendations is whichever one you choose, be consistent with the setup and the execution. Minimal effective padding to achieve the comfort of the test, especially if you're going to be looking at rate of force development and more rapid based onsets. That's going to be padding can influence the results. It can also produce instability depending on the amount of padding that is being applied. But you also want the individual to be comfortable. Applying more tension to the belt or the fixated system than you otherwise want, particularly with your DYI with the handheld dynamometer. So go 90% of the way efforts or tension with the warm-up repetitions. After the individual does that, go ahead and cinch it up the final 10% to ensure that the heel does not actually lift and that you don't get any energy leaks within the setup or the system itself. And then ensure proper seated height to avoid hip flexor cramping and to achieve best results. So that's going to be right around your 90-degree marker of hip flexion as shown. Okay, so what kind of forces can we produce and expect with this? So they're actually quite high depending on the demographic that you're looking at. So they consistently fluctuate anywhere between 1.8 and 2.6 times body weight. So with the Premier League football teams, Seth O'Neill has done an incredible amount of work with this as well as with the rugby teams and has found right around 2.0 times body weight, whereas the Everton Academy has shown up to 2.6. And then in recreational runners, it's been shown to be 1.8 to 2.0 times body weight. Really good retest reliability. Standard error of measure, you can see there in newtons, which equates to about 9 to 12%, which again is in the acceptable range. If your utilization of the do-it-yourself format or setup, body weight ratio percentage has been described not quite as high as that of the force plate setup with 127 to 136% body weight depending on your gender. And then you can see the minimal detectable change of what would be considered meaningful if you're going to track this over time. And with the fixed dynamometer, ideally, again, the microfit only gives you your force output, but if you wanted to, it would be recommended to have a handheld dynamometer that gives you the force time curve as well, especially if you're going to be doing power, that's going to be a necessity. But otherwise, a good assessment for isometric force production and power. All right, so when we look at the demands of running for the foot, we'll look at the kinetics, the kinematics, and the muscle demands. So when we consider the role of the foot when we're running or with honestly any forward locomotion, I want to utilize this diagram here to kind of express its function such that the better we understand how it is intended to function, I think the better we'll understand the kinematics and the kinetics that we'll discuss. So on the first y-axis, that is the one to the left, we have the change in joint angle. And then on the second y-axis, we have the change in the muscle tendinous unit length as the foot progresses through the initial contact and through the toe-off phase. And then we see 3 lines. So the MTP extension is shown in the dark dotted line. And then the red dotted line is the longitudinal axis. And then the black solid line is the muscle tendinous unit and how it recoils. So we can see that as soon as the heel hits the ground, that the MTP joint as well as the longitudinal axis go through a joint excursion. Specifically, the longitudinal axis essentially extends and then recoils, as you can see it in that somewhat of an inverted U shape. The MTP joint does the kind of the opposite. It initially extends and then it flexes, and then it will extend again as it pushes off. And the muscle tendinous unit, I think, really alludes to the function and the role of the muscles of the foot as the joint angles change. So the muscle tendinous unit, as it goes into that big inverted U, is really where the muscles are being stretched, and then they're actively and elastically recoiling during the mid to later stages to allow for further push off and a more rigid lever that can translate force into the ground. And so the more of a inverted U that occurs, the more excursion and stretching also occurs. The ideal would be a more rigid foot, such that we're not getting an energy leak from the forces that are produced not only by the ground extrinsically, but also internally. And so the plantar flexor intrinsic foot muscles, we'll call them the FIM, actively lengthen during the early stance to absorb mechanical power and stiffen the arch. During that later phase, the FIM shorten to return the power and assist with forward propulsion. And it's this active adaptation of the foot stiffness that improves foot ground force transmission and reduces the strain on passive ligamentous structures of the foot. The plantar aponeurosis and the FIM act in parallel to regulate foot stiffness during the locomotion. And the activation of the plantar intrinsic foot muscles increase with gait velocity, significantly contributing to the energy absorption and thus the return. The contribution of the FIM becomes more significant as the gait velocity and force demands also increase. And here's another schematic of kind of that windlass mechanism and the stiffening as the foot translates through the initial to the late stance phase. So similar concepts are conveyed here. So the push off of the intrinsic foot muscles and the intrinsic foot muscles, that is the toe flexors, work as functional groups to stiffen the MTP and the longitudinal arch to augment the ability to generate propulsive power. Removing the capacity to activate the intrinsic foot muscles alters the leveraging function of the foot and ankle joint muscles that are used for the production of forward propulsion, and thereby they affecting the vertical jump performance and also require an increased proximal muscle activation during running. So toe flexor strength, both the intrinsic foot muscles as well as the extrinsic foot muscles, is immoderately correlated with the performance during a 50-meter sprint, pro agility tests, three-cone testing, and various vertical jumps. Both muscles, intrinsic and extrinsic to the foot, have greater effect on sprinting and horizontal jump performance than vertical jump performance, and the foot strength is a greater impact on horizontal oriented explosive movements, i.e. running, than is the vertically oriented one, such as vertical ground reaction force with doing a vertical jump and or land. And so needless to say, the point of these first couple slides here are really to express what is the normal function of the foot during our forward propulsion and its importance in being a energy storing and returning structure rather than energy leak, and that our horizontal propulsion is dependent, our performance is dependent upon how well our foot strength is and how well it is able to restore that energy that is produced by the more proximal muscle groups. Similar to what we have discussed in previous portions of the presentation and along the other aspects of the kinetic chain is the range of motion. So the plantar flexion range of motion here of the hallux is what we're speaking of specifically, is anywhere between 3 and 43 degrees, and we need a ton of dorsiflexion depending on how much depending on the speed at which we're moving horizontally, up to 100 degrees of extension, but typically it's usually around 60 to 70 degrees. And you can see that the ranges vary there, with the hallux dorsiflexion during gait and running is between 60 and 84 degrees of extension. So less than 50% decrease in range of motion can be accommodated through the gait adjustments, such as the foot and the leg external rotation and decreased stride length, and increase ankle, knee, and hip motion. But it can only compensate so much, so hallux rigidus can significantly be a problem. And not only does it need a significant amount of motion, but the hallux supports up to 40 to 60% of the body weight, which is 2 times that of the lesser toes. And greater than 60%, 60 degrees of dorsiflexion is considered normal in barefoot walking on a level surface. It's also important to acknowledge the role of the sesamoids here. So sesamoidectomy, so when the sesamoids are removed, the tibial excision specifically results in 11% loss of flexor power, whereas when the fibula sesamoid is taken out, a 19% loss, and then when they're both are excised, a 32% loss. So that length tension relationship, not estranged from that of the patella at the knee, really allows for a significant and meaningful force generation capacity of the hallux flexor. So the foot kinematics with running. So when we're looking at the power, so it's shown on the y-axis watts per kilogram, but this is consistent with what we've seen in our previous joints. And when we're looking at the joint power, we can convert this to percentage body weight per second. We can also convert this to the foot pounds per pound per second, and taking it out of the watts, so that we have consistent units across the different body regions or joint regions that we've discussed. And you can see that the the peak negative power is comparable, maybe initially, depending on the speed at which someone's going. So at lower speeds, there's almost a 1-to-1 positive power to negative power ratio. But as you get faster and faster, there's a greater amount of negative work that is produced in relationship to the concentric power. And so it just speaks again to the importance of shock absorption and then to the restoring capacity of the foot as the individual gradually increases in their speed of gait. When we're looking at force production, so maybe for some this is an easier graph or figure to conceptualize. So on the y-axis we have work, which is joules per kilogram, and then we have the negative work when the foot is deforming, and then we have the positive work as the individual pushes off. And so the peak positive work is going to be close to 5.3 to 5.5% of body weight, and then the negative work is going to be significantly more. Again, we see that same relationship and ratio between the positive work and the negative work occurring over time, with faster speeds. So as individuals gets to 9.8 miles per hour, then the work capacity of the foot intrinsics specifically will increase along the negative work at a disproportionate rate to an increase in the positive work, which is pretty much consistent regardless of the speed at which someone is traveling or running. And so I think that it's worth noting these kinematic variables because it gives us an idea as to the demand that is placed upon them and the importance of training them. I will say that unlike some of the other major muscle groups and joints of the lower extremity, the methodology here becomes a little bit more difficult to be able to isolate the true foot power production just because of the size and the multi-articular nature of the foot. Though hallux flexion can be measured and quantified in relationship to body weight, and then depending on what device that you're using to measure the force per second can also be quantified in regards to capturing the power. I think I haven't seen a clinically friendly version of looking at the negative work or measuring the negative work. I think that would be a little bit difficult to do, but I will show you some clinical assessments that I utilize in order to determine or to ensure that the foot has sufficient capacity to be able to keep up with the rest of the kinetic chain in relationship to body weight. So this study is maybe a little bit tangential, but I think it's worth expressing because it was really profound for me in regards to how it further conveyed the importance of the foot intrinsic muscles. So you had 12 participants, males and females, around 30 years of age, plus or minus 6 years. The experimental condition was a tibial nerve block confirmed via a fine wire EMG from the flexor digitorum brevis during the electrical stimulation of the tibial nerve. And the control group did not have a nerve block. And so they did a walking and running. The FR stands for the Franz, the Froude number, which is essentially a standard unit that is that takes into relationship the gravity as well as the limb length of the individual. So it's more of a scientific standardization of speed for all intents and purposes. It doesn't matter significantly here, except that usually the transition from walking to running occurs at 0.5 Franz. So walking and running, and it's normalized to the individual based off their limb length. And so the task was walking and running on an AMTI instrumented treadmill, and for 60 seconds, and the data was collected for 16 seconds at the end of the trial, and they had the control and the experimental groups, the control being the healthy condition, and then the experimental condition was when they did the nerve block, and it was a crossover trial. So you have 4 graphs. So on the A and B, you have the foot power for both the walking and then the running respectively. And then for the C and D, you have the walking and running, but ankle power shown. And then for both conditions, so the black dark line is the control condition where there's no tibial block. And then for the gray, you have that is the experimental where there is a tibial block, and thus the individual has a compromise in their foot intrinsic activation. You can see that with the ankle power, there's really no change, regardless of whether you're looking at walking or running, and we would expect as much because the ankle plantar flexors are not necessarily affected by the tibial nerve block as much as the foot intrinsics are. And then what we can see here is that the foot power is significantly increased in the control group, which represents the black line versus the gray line, which is the blocked group. So it shows that the foot power significantly drops in both conditions, which we would expect. But where is the compensation being made up for? All right, so in the cluster histogram here, you have the work on the y-axis for all three conditions: the walking, the slow run, and the fast run. And the black represents the control. The gray represents the anesthetized tibial nerve. And you can see that the asterisk represents the difference between the two cohorts. So in the walking group, as expected, the foot work drops in a significant fashion, but in the experimental group, the hip and the proximal muscles have to make up for that change. During the running, the ankle and the foot have a significant difference. And then once again, with the faster running, the hip and the proximal muscles have to take up the slack for what is lost proximally. And so this just represents the importance of that. Yeah, you may get someone who comes in with maybe a tendinopathy around their hip, or additionally overuse injuries higher up the chain, but that may be indeed a victim rather than the true culprit, where the culprit may be indeed the foot, and the loss of energy at the foot leads to a greater demand higher up in the kinetic chain and potential overuse of those muscles. All right, so let's start off with motor coordination. So I use a modified spring ankle test, which is a navicular drop test. It's formulated from and described by Cal Dietz in Triphasic. So there's three components. So you have this single leg sit to stand, where the client goes from a non-weight bearing to a weight bearing position. You're looking for less than 5 millimeters of drop from the non-weight bearing to the weight bearing. Then you have a single leg squat, where you ask the client to go into a single leg squat position where the knee translates 2 inches past the second and third metatarsal. And once again, you're looking for less than 3 to 5 millimeters drop with the ability to achieve that 2 inches over toe. So there needs to be sufficient dorsiflexion and sufficient tension within the arch, such that they don't go into more of a pronated position. And then the single leg calf raise, where the client performs a single leg calf raise with maximal heel height and is able to achieve a greater than 45 degree angle of the foot relative to the floor. And you can see the involved versus the uninvolved limb here. I don't think I need to clarify which one's which. And then in the third video, you can see that there's the utilization of a translucent goniometer, where the clinician can, in live time, monitor the navicular drop. Also, a classic index card can also be utilized in order to measure the discrepancies during the different phases. And this motor coordination test would be considered to be sufficient. It is more of a field-based qualitative assessment. That being said, I found good utility in not only determining someone's capabilities here, but also recognizing when additional work would be otherwise necessary. And you can certainly see discrepancies between one limb and the next. Okay, let's turn to muscle endurance. So for the foot intrinsic, I utilize, again, pulling from Triphasic and Cal Dietz recommendation. I really like these field tests. I found that good clinical utility, easy applicability, and then the assessment then becomes the intervention. So there's 4 conditions. So the first 2 conditions, you have knee straight. Condition 1 is in a plantar flex position. The second is in a max dorsiflex position. Condition 3 and 4 have knee flex positions. You're flexing the knee to 75 to 90 degrees, and then you're going into either max plantar flexion and or max dorsiflexion, depending on the condition. Your criteria here is that they should be able to hold each position against body weight for 60 seconds and without letting the heel height drop by more than 20%. The limb symmetry indices based off time should be within 10%, and that is in again, your outcome is in seconds. For higher level athletes, it is due to the additional demands that are needed for the foot, and in order to have that important energy storing capacity and return and counteract the deformation of the ground reaction forces, as well as the intrinsic forces that are generated by the ankle, hip, and knee. It is recommended these athletes are able to perform the 60-second holds with body weight for greater than 20% of their body weight. Again, they can hold this weight, or they could also utilize a weight vest. Okay, and again, this is a field-based test. Recognize that its limitations, but the ease of applicability, its translation directly into interventions, the quantification of foot strength across time and the monitoring of that has really made it a really nice, good utility for testing people's foot intrinsic endurance. And here's just a closer caption, right? So you have the equipment, the different conditions, the modifications as shown in the left-hand portion of the screen, and then the different images. So you do have the option. I use a small, again, it's just a foam dowel with a Crayola marker stuck in between, or you can use a Sharpie as well, where the individual also has to flex around the dowel such that you engage the foot. The EMG of the foot is significantly higher with that, is what I have found. Particularly, people often feel it in the arch and in the foot specifically. And you can see the sagittal as well as the frontal plane positions. So we've spoken about the importance of the foot and the ankle, and specifically the role that the foot and the longitudinal arch plays during forward locomotion. We've spoken about the kinetics as well as the kinematics of the foot as an individual goes through different running speeds. We've spoken about how to go about testing that. This specific summary slide here really just kind of re-emphasizes the points that were made at the beginning of the presentation. Important contributors for the lower limb power transfer and push off are indeed the ankle plantar flexion power, the foot structures to resist the deformation, and the power of the foot and the ankle or plantar flexors is equally as important as the capacity of the foot structures to resist the deformation and efficiently promote power transfer during push off. And so whatever the hip, knee, and ankle power generation is, and whatever the capacities and capabilities are, if the foot system deforms under tension, is not able to transfer the power into the ground, your technique, mechanical efficiency, effectiveness, and ultimately acceleration of performance, forward propulsion, that is in our cases of discussion, running, gradually degrade. Okay, any questions, comments, or feedback that you have, by all means, you can leave them in the comments section below. Here are the references for this presentation.